All right. I'm going to kick us off. Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you all to today's speaker series event for the Meltzer Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging. My name is Kenji Yoshino, and I'm the faculty director of the Meltzer Center, as well as being the Chief Justice Earl Warren Professor of Constitutional Law here at NYU School of Law. I'd like to begin by thanking all of our sponsors. So we've gotten mightier since even the last time that we spoke, and we're incredibly proud and honored to have so many people contributing to this incredible community. So we can't thank you enough. Obviously, without your support, we couldn't do the work that we do. For this event, I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished guest, Andy Marra, Executive Director of the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund, or TILDEF. Andy has served as the Executive Director of TILDEF since 2018. This year, TILDEF will merge with the National Center for Trans Equality to become Advocates for Trans Equality, or A4TE. Andy will serve as the Chief Executive Officer of this newly formed organization. Prior to joining TILDEF, she held leadership and communications roles at the Arcus Foundation, GLSEN, Na Dut Dol for Korean Community Development, and GLAAD. Andy currently serves on the board of directors for Lambda Literary and has served on the boards and advisory councils of Freedom for All Americans, Chinese for Affirmative Action, the Funding Exchange, Human Rights Campaign, Just Detention International, and the National Center for Transgender Equality. Andy has been honored by the White House and the City of New York for her contributions to the LGBTQ community. I'm delighted to welcome Andy to NYU Law. Towards the end of today's program, I'll open up for Q&A, so please stay tuned. And if you have any questions, please submit them through the QA button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. So first of all, Andy, that was an incredible record of public service that I just read out. Welcome to our center, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, and it's also a delight to be back with your colleagues and students at NYU Law. I was here before and spoke to folks at the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Center, and it's always a delight to be here with y'all.
Thank you. So we're here today to talk about trans rights, yet some of the underlying concepts here are still unfamiliar to many individuals, even those who are tuning in today. So let's start by defining terms. What does it mean to be transgender, non-binary, or gender non-conforming?
Yeah, this is a really important question, and often a question that we immediately answer at the beginning of trainings that we provide to law firms, some of which I saw on the sponsor screen. So apologies for those folks if this is a repeat, but there are three terms. There's transgender, there's non-binary, and there's gender non-conforming. And we often see these terms used in news headlines, in reports, articles. And so very briefly and at a very high level, I want to give folks some grounding about how I use these terms and how we use these terms in the movement and their application. So let's start with transgender. Transgender is a term used to describe individuals who identify with a sex not assigned at birth, meaning if a person was assigned male at birth and they identify as transgender, probably they identify as a trans woman or not with the gender that and also the norms that come with that particular identity. So again, transgender means this is a person who does not identify with their sex assigned at birth. It's often also used as an umbrella term too, right? So as many people probably know and are watching, there are a number of trans people out in the world. Many folks identify very differently and often within the trans community, and oftentimes we use transgender as an umbrella term to describe people who are just simply do not identify with either their sex assigned at birth or also the gender binary, male and female, or do not identify with the stereotypical behaviors that come with a particular gender that society has prescribed. Non-binary. What does that mean? Well, this is a person that does not identify within the gender binary and may in fact actually identify with one or more genders. So this person could be, let's say, assigned male at birth, but they may not express their gender that way. They may in fact express their gender a little bit more feminine or a little bit more androgynous because they just simply don't identify with all of the roles and expectations and standards that come with a particular gender within the gender binary. And then lastly, gender nonconforming, very simply, this is just refers to a person's gender expression or presentation that may not fit within, again, the gender binary. So this is referring to things like, behavior, social roles, personal appearances, and this term also does not just necessarily apply to trans people. This could apply to non-trans people who simply are tomboys or are simply like to wear pink. And so sometimes people use this term not just to describe how they identify and how they're presenting themselves to the world, but also they sometimes use this term as a form of action or a form of protest to be in solidarity with trans people, even though they may not necessarily identify as trans.
Wonderful, thank you. So as noted, you've really spent, it's quite moving how long you have been involved with the LGBTQ plus movement and how much energy and passion you've devoted to it. So for which all of our thanks. I'm curious as to how you would assess the trans rights component of the movement and the broader cultural conversations around trans issues as having evolved over time. So what do you see now that has changed since you began the work?
So let me rewind, and now I suppose I'm going to reveal my age a little bit. But when I first started working the movement back in the early 2000s at Double A GLAAD, the movement and our community were in a very different place in terms of how our community looked and also the issues that were being prioritized in our movement towards equality and freedom. And as you can expect, around the early 2000s and into the mid 2000s, a lot of our movement's time was focused on marriage equality. And for trans people at this time, there was not a lot of visibility and there was not a lot of representation within our movement and community. In fact, many of our organizations were not even founded up until the early 2000s. For TILDEF, we were founded in 2003. For our sibling organizations or nibbling organizations, they were founded in 2002. That's the Transgender Law Center. And the National Center for Transgender Equality was also founded in 2003. So the three national trans organizations, in comparison to the likes of Lambda Legal or the Human Rights Campaign, are still fairly young. And a lot of it has to do with the structural and systemic barriers that trans people have been navigating for decades. And I would say up until the present, even. And so at the time when I started and I entered into the work, our movement was in many ways at a crossroads. I think there was a lot of energy and growing enthusiasm, I think, for the momentum for marriage equality, but also there was a lot of tension and there was a lot of critique from trans folks about the lack of representation of our issues and also how under-resourced they were by our supporters. A lot of the support during that time was going directly to marriage equality. And as a result, a lot of other really important issue areas, not just specific to trans folks, but more broadly, the LGBTQ plus community were deprioritized as a result. Now, that's not to say this is an us versus them dynamic. It's not. But it is, I think, a reality that trans people have been grappling with for quite some time. And we have seen, I think, through a lot of hard work by folks that came before me, as well as people that I consider mentors and colleagues, we've made a substantial amount of progress in advancing the representation of trans issues and streamlining trans issues into the larger, I think, the DNA of our movement. We've seen a lot of this happen, especially I think in the 20 teens, as I'm starting to call them, I think that was in part because of folks like Janet Mock and Laverne Cox, Caitlyn Jenner, and many other trans folks coming out and sharing their stories, their lived experiences, and also the challenges, the hopes, and the dreams that I think that a lot of us have had, but many people just didn't have a face or a person to attach to. So we've done an incredible amount of work, I think, in the 20 teens around visibility, but I think for many activists in our movement right now, we are seeing a real distinction between the impact of visibility versus the impact of like representation and what that means to be, for instance, at the decision-making table versus being seen in the news. For some reason, visibility is not translating into acceptance of trans lives and trans people. And I think it points to really the leading priority for our community and movement in investing and sharing the stories, the personal stories of trans people, our lived experiences, as well as the experiences of our families and friends who support us.
Thank you so much. You mentioned that you work with AA GLAAD, and just so we set the table for folks, there are two organizations with the acronym GLAAD in the LGBTQ plus space, and GLAAD with a single A is Gay and Lesbian Advocates and Defenders, which is a legal organization. And AA GLAAD is a nonprofit LGBTQ advocacy organization that focuses on cultural change to ensure fair, accurate, and inclusive representation in media. So just to read people in on that single A versus AA distinction. So, so Andy, the Human Rights Campaign published a report in November of last year titled "The Epidemic of Violence Against the Transgender and Gender Nonconforming Community in the United States." In the report, the HRC notes that in 2023, a record high of more than 550 anti-LGBTQ plus bills were introduced in state houses across the country, more than 80 of which were passed into law. So this is obviously a stunning upsurge. Can you set the scene for us? How did we even get here?
Yeah, well, let's start with where I last left off, and that was talking about marriage equality. And as folks remember, back in the 20 teens, we won. The Supreme Court ruled in favor in the matter of Obergefell and delivered an opinion that found that marriage equality is constitutional, and prohibiting marriage for same-sex couples is just unconstitutional in this country. And so we witnessed, I think, the floodgates of a lot of loving and committed couples rush to their city halls to get married. And I think the secret sauce, or one of the winning strategies for the work that much in part was led by Evan Wolfson at Freedom to Marry, was the importance of culture change and the importance of personalizing the issues so that our neighbors, our colleagues, our friends, our fellow congregants at places of worship understand exactly what it means for a same-sex couple to want to get married. And it was, I think, it's important to note that, for many years, our movement focused on talking about the facts, like all of the 14 or 1500 rights that come with marriage, right? And we thought that was the winning strategy, or one of the winning tools in our toolbox to win on that point. But the reality is, it was actually talking about the warm fuzzies, like why we want to get married, why our gay and lesbian colleagues want to get married, and what it means to them, and what it means to their relationship, what it means to their families, and what it means for their future. And that changed hearts and minds. Very similarly, our on the other side of the house, our opposition, as we call them, so folks at the Alliance Defending Freedom, the Heritage Foundation, Focus on the Family Research Council, Concerned Women for America, the Federalist Society, I could go on. These organizations obviously did not win. And instead of kicking up their heels and kicking up dust and walking away, they actually paid attention to what our movement did. And I think with the incredible amount of vitriol that we are witnessing in this country, They learned from the movement's playbook on how to change the conversation around what I would describe dinner table topics. And that's not just specific to trans issues, that's applicable to a number of issues that we know are right now a part of the hot topics of this country right now. Everything from the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion and critical race to theory to trans issues to a number of other concerns that have been whipped up into this maelstrom engineered by the opposition. I do want to say that this started this started several years ago, and I want to say it started back in the early 2020s, late 20 teens, and it really started with the Alliance Defending Freedom putting feelers out, as it were, by developing model legislation for state leaders, state lawmakers to introduce into state houses across the country. One good example is Idaho. Folks may remember a few years ago that Idaho was in the headlines for pursuing a number of anti-trans policies. And in the investigatory journalism that subsequently came forward, it was found that the legislation was in fact that was introduced in their state legislature was verbatim the model legislation that was provided by the Alliance Defending Freedom. Fast forward a couple of years later, we see similar kinds of bills being introduced across the country, and almost verbatim, it's from these organizations. It's not from constituents. Constituents for these lawmakers have not been insisting on, making sure like trans young people are not allowed to play sports in schools. Constituents are not pushing for healthcare bans, criminalizing healthcare for trans people. These efforts were engineered and have been driven by a handful of anti-trans extremists with a lot of resources and have been pursuing this almost this tsunami of anti-trans legislative attacks in part with state lawmakers. Lawmakers that generally affiliate themselves with these organizations, but may not necessarily have a direct connection to the issue or to the community. And as a result, we have seen, we have gone over the past 3 years from seeing, maybe 100, couple hundred anti-trans bills introduced in state legislatures across the country to last year, there being over 550. And this is not a coincidence. This is a concerted effort, again, by opposition to not just, I think, scapegoat trans people and also further marginalize trans people, but really using trans people as a political wedge, as a political tool to further other bigger issues at hand.
Thank you for that. So this anti-trans legislation covers a wide range of issues. So I'd like to drill down a little bit. And I see the buckets. There's access to healthcare, there's public accommodations access, there's access to sports, there's the content of school curricula. I'm sure I'm leaving other things out. You can instruct me. But can you give a sense of what is going on in this legislative arena? What is this legislation doing, and what impacts does it have on the lived experience of trans people in this country?
Yeah, this is the not so great answer that I need to give for folks tuning in, and it's very timely. Many folks probably who have been following the news are aware of the death of a young non-binary student by the name of Nex Benedict. Nex was a 16-year-old student and also an Indigenous person of the Choctaw Nation and died last week in Oklahoma, a state that has already proposed over 50 anti-LGBTQ bills this year alone. And they're one of the states with among the most bills, anti-LGBTQ bills introduced in the country, and is also the fourth in the country for book bans in schools too. So just to kind of set the stage. The political rhetoric and the active advancement of these bills have fatal consequences And I think it's important to note that for next, this, I think what's perhaps most ironic in a very cruel way is that Nex was physically assaulted by their peers in a bathroom. And we know that bathrooms and other forms of public accommodations have come under fire um, over the years. And yet we are seeing that trans people are not the terrible boogeyman that I think many would try to paint us as, but rather we're often the victims. We are often the ones targeted in these kinds of spaces simply because we are trans and simply because people do not like us for who we are. And this certainly was the case for Nex. The state superintendent, who has certainly come under fire and come under scrutiny over the last a week or so, you know, I think has made his politics clear about what matters to Oklahoma educators as well as to Oklahoma parents that are sending their young people to schools. And it's not the kinds of issues that I think are appropriate for an educational environment. I don't know why a state superintendent wants to endorse um, guns. I don't. I don't understand why the state superintendent wouldn't be more concerned about making sure that their state education budget is fully funded, and making sure that young people are able to not only feel safe in schools but thrive. But instead, we have seen in Oklahoma the complete opposite, and as a result, we have seen the aftermath of what can happen. These kinds of bills that are being introduced by anti-trans politicians, they are inviting discrimination and they are also inciting hatred. And I think it's also important to note, folks are probably wondering what are in these bills themselves, or what's the actual language include. And it's things like banning access to like basic best practice medical care. Other bills are limiting young people from being able to do everyday normal things like playing sports with their friends. And regardless of what the issue is that's being deliberated in a particular or addressed in a particular bill, is that all of these legislative efforts are designed to send a message to our young people that they're not welcome nor safe to be themselves, just simply put. And we've already seen as a result families leaving their states out of fear for their children. And I think, for TILDEF in particular, and with some of our work that's occurred in some hotbed states, we have seen the need for providing pro bono counsel to families, the need for providing know your rights resources, because families are scared and they truly are leaving. They're truly leaving their communities behind and becoming migrants in their own country. The last thing I'll say too is that there is empirical evidence on the impact of these bills, and I would point to the Trevor Project, a wonderful organization that provides crisis support to LGBTQ young people across the country. They operate a 24/7 suicide hotline. And they also have conducted research that has found that this political rhetoric and these bills actually do have an adverse impact, a profound adverse impact on young people's mental health and their well-being. And I think with the tragic loss of Nex, it is the true and ultimate price that I think trans people are paying right now for these discriminatory and just these cruel bills.
Thank you for that again, Andy. So I actually would like to get your help on answering some, objections that are held even by some who aren't socially conservative. Before Bostock, I testified on the Hill for the Equality Act, Bostock being the 2020 case that brought trans individuals within the protections of Title VII. But when I was testifying for the Equality Act, one of the people testifying on the other side was a scholar of Title IX, the legislation that prohibits sex discrimination in education. And this scholar insisted that she was progressive on every single issue except for those relating to Title IX and trans athletes. Her argument was that it was unfair to make cisgender women compete against trans women in athletic competitions. So we see this argument a lot. What is the best response, in your view, to that argument?
Well, this is not a one size fits all. But here's my take. First and foremost, these kinds of bills designed to prohibit young people from participating in sports or at school athletics, nobody's asking for them. No, there is not a massive movement, despite what I think our opposition would like to portray. There is not a massive movement calling for these cruel bills or policies, simply put. And I think in actually looking at the language of these bills and policies for us at TILDEF and as well as our other litigation colleagues across the country, we assert they violate Title IX and the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution. I think, though, anecdotally, just talk about the everyday impacts, trans people, particularly trans students in this case, they want to play sports just like every other young person, every other kid. And I think when we talk about sports, oftentimes we see the argument around competitive sports, particularly in high schools or in higher education. But for the mass majority of our young people, we're talking about sports where they're designed to encourage values like teamwork, leadership skills, negotiation, and many other, I think, good things that we would want to see our young people learn about, develop, and value as they grow older. That's the I view sports to be. That is the whole heart of sports for young people. Singling out our young people is just a way to further marginalize and harm students, and it sends the wrong message. I think that goes against what I think schools are all about, where students should feel welcome. All students should feel welcome in their schools. They should feel safe, and they should be given the opportunities, equal opportunities to realize their full potential. And I think it's also important to note too that we have had a lot of guidance that has existed for, I want to say, almost a decade and a half, almost 2 decades on this subject. The NCAA had developed guidelines around trans student participation in collegiate sports, and they have been very effective in being able to ensure that competitive sports are not inequitable between trans and non-trans young people. I also think it's important to note too that a lot of the rhetoric and certainly reflected in the policies is rooted not just in transphobia or anti-trans attitudes, but also reflects, I think, similar arguments that have been applied to other folks in this country. And I'll just use this one example. Cis girls or non-trans girls, particularly non-trans Black girls, already know what it's like to have their bodies policed in this country and their abilities policed in sports because of race-based stereotypes about how a woman's body should look. And we are seeing the same kind of argument or strategy applied, except it's being applied to trans young people. And I would posit that we are going to win on this matter because, quite frankly, I think our opposition is struggling to answer the question of how do we make sure, if we are going to advocate for segregation, legal segregation or prohibition of sports for trans young people, how do we make sure that it does not violate the Constitution? And I just simply think it is a futile exercise. The caveat to that, though, and I think this speaks to the sophistication of our opposition, is actually the person that you just named. Our opposition has developed, I think, a really unique approach in finding unlikely bedfellows or allies in their work. And with the rise, I think, of like Moms for Liberty and the like, this reflects a lot of quiet organizing that's occurred behind the scenes with a lot of these our anti-trans organizations quietly looking to build partnerships and alliances with second wave feminists and the like to not only, and this is just my opinion, to subvert and pervert feminism and the values of feminism, but also to create a new type of feminism that really leans into the exclusion and the targeting of trans people. This is not new. We have seen this before in our movement and community, but I think at the height and pitch of it is new for us. And so this is just important for trans folks, a good reminder for trans folks as well as our allies, particularly women and feminists, period, to really scrutinize the kinds of feminist politics that are being applied to these kinds of arguments and to interrogate why so-called feminists are applying these kinds of values to these kinds of bills and these kinds of conversations in our country.
Great. And I can't resist continuing on in the vein of leaning into your help as a expert on how we should respond to common concerns from the other side. So another one that I hear quite frequently relates to children. So when an opponent of trans rights says, I just worry about minors transitioning gender at too young an age, what is the best response to that?
Yeah, so I think there's certainly the empirical response or the response with empirical evidence, but there's also the personal response. But let me start with the empirical stuff. First, I think there's a lot of confusion in this country around what trans medicine is and is not, and what it means for a trans person to transition. So let me start with the basics. When a trans person comes out, oftentimes they are also thinking about what it means to transition into the gender that they identify with. So for myself, when I came out to my family and friends, I said, "Hi, my name is Andy. I identify as a trans woman. Here is my story." And oftentimes the questions that come are that follow are like, "Well, what does it mean for you to transition?" And there are a number of ways trans people have to transition in our society. There's legal transition, and for us at TILDEF, that often means like legally changing your name. That's often the first step for a trans person in legally transitioning, and also making sure that their gender marker is updated on their government identification. Then there are things like social transition. In many ways, introducing yourself or reintroducing yourself to your community members, your colleagues, your friends, your family members as the person that you have authentically seen yourself as and want the world to know you as. And then there's medical transition, right? This is referring to all of the types of care that trans people may access to medically transition into the gender that they identify as. And, folks commonly see this as either being hormones or hormone replacement therapy, as well as transition-related surgeries. Transition is not a one-size-fits-all for every trans person. And so I lift that up in particular to name that there is a lot of medicine and science that has been developed and studied over the years. I want to say decades at this rate, 4 or 5 decades almost, that contain a great amount of standards and guidance that a number of medical professionals have to account and refer to. I think also it's important to name trans people have to access, if they choose to medically transition, they have to access a team of medical providers. It's not just a primary care physician saying, let's just wave a magic wand and make everything happen immediately, but rather it requires a team to medically transition, an interdisciplinary specialized team of folks like urologists, endocrinologists, psychologists, primary care providers, a whole holistic team to inform what kinds of medical care are needed and what kind of regimens should be prescribed. The reason I am saying all of this is because I want folks to know that medical care for trans people is an established science and form of medicine that takes years for providers to become trained in and to receive ongoing professional development in. This is not willy-nilly science. This is not something that's just emerged over the past few years. This is an established practice that a lot of everyday people just simply are not familiar with because it's a specialized form of medicine. I also want to name for people too. I think there's a lot of confusion in in this country, especially in like everyday conversations, that there's an assumption that trans young people, particularly under the age of 18 or minors, are just out there going to have surgeries and accessing hormone therapy and making bad choices. In response to that, I would say two things. One, um, I think there's a lot of confusion on the actual regimens provided for trans minors versus trans adults. There's actual distinctions between those two categories. And for a lot of folks, I think they confuse medical transition with social support. So for oftentimes for our young people, when they come out at an early age, it starts with accessing what we would describe as like social support groups, seeking out mental health providers that can explore and making sure that parents and other family members and other folks in that person's community, that young person's community, have access to the resources and support that they need to understand what it means for this young person to be coming out as trans so early. And oftentimes it includes like things like family support groups, children's groups, teen groups, for individuals to get to know themselves, get to know their peers, and really have the time to figure out what it means to be trans at this point in their lives. Medical care is often relegated to older ages, and it also requires best in practice or best in care guidance from specialists like the ones that I just named. So it's not easy to access per se. It requires a team of folks. And there are distinctions between the kinds of care that young people receive versus the kinds of medical care that adults receive. And I think with all of that being taken into account, there needs to be a larger conversation about what trans healthcare really is versus what folks want to muddle it up and say it is when it is not.
Yeah, that's incredibly helpful, and particularly the idea that medicine itself is internalized differences in age, right? So that we don't need to be as worried because there's a time-honored practice internal to the medical profession itself for making those necessary age-related adjustments is incredibly helpful to hear. So I want to shift gears a little bit. Oftentimes these rejoinders, come into play in the courts, and we've talked about legislation, but not about the courts. And I've been dying to ask you about this post-Bostock landscape. For those of you who are tuning in, I mentioned this decision earlier, but it's a 2020 case from the United States Supreme Court that held that the prohibition on sex discrimination in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 extends to both sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination. So this was seen as a big win for the LGBTQ plus community, as far as from where I sit, at least. And we've had a couple of sequels. In January of this year, the court declined to review a Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals decision where the appeals court ruled in favor of the trans student who had challenged an Indiana school district's restroom policy. And this made it the third time in the last year that the Supreme Court has refused to hear a case seeking to restrict trans rights. So two questions for this, Andy. One is, how do you assess the current Supreme Court on trans issues? Because on the one hand, we've had these wins or denials of review, but on the other hand, we know it's a very conservative court. And then the second question is, what are TILDEF and other public interest litigation organizations doing to challenge anti-trans litigation or legislation rather, and how have courts been responding to those challenges so far?
I've been waiting for this question, Kenji, and I have come with receipts. So everyone just buckle up. I have a lot to share with you. First and foremost, Bostock has been an incredibly effective legal tool for TILDEF and our colleague organizations. For TILDEF, we have applied Bostock and the legal theories behind Bostock in many of our matters, and we have won. So let me talk a little bit about that. So for TILDEF, we focus largely on what I would describe as the bread and butter issues of the trans community in terms of our legal advocacy practice. First and foremost, we focus on name and gender recognition as one of our key issues. We also focus on healthcare and healthcare, explicitly health insurance coverage access for trans people, both public and private. And then lastly, we also focus on conditions of confinement as vis-a-vis focusing largely on trans people who are incarcerated and held in jails. For a lot of our healthcare matters, we have applied Bostock in our litigation. And it's really because of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, right? And I just think it's important to note too that in the Bostock ruling, this was the first time it was enjoined. There were three, technically, before it was just Bostock, there were three lawsuits that were working their way up the courts involving employment non-discrimination matters. One involved someone that jumped out of planes for a living who is openly gay and was discriminated in their job. Another was a social worker in a school in Georgia, vis-a-vis Mr. Bostock. And there was also Amy Stevens up in Michigan, a funeral home director who was fired from her job because she chose to come out and transition as Amy Stevens. Those three matters made their way up to the court. They were enjoined, which led to the ruling that any employment non-discrimination is the law of the land, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. And for us, gender identity is also at play under the category of sex as well. Federal law has established that through a lot of work over the years, that sex, specifically the category of sex, also includes gender identity. So that being said, we have applied Bostock to healthcare matters in Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and a couple of other places as well too. States that you can imagine are politically hostile and conservative. And yet in North Carolina and Georgia, back in 2022, we announced the first ruling of its kind out of the Fourth Circuit that found that no employer can prohibit or exclude insurance coverage tied to transition-related care. This was a big deal, and and if it wasn't for celebrating that particular win in Georgia, the next week we won in North Carolina as well, that an employer cannot also prohibit or deny or exclude coverage simply because a person is trans and are accessing transition-related care. That was all Bostock. Those matters have been appealed, and we have continued to make compelling arguments in the appellate. I will say that in one of the arguments for the Georgia matter in particular, one of the judges that heard oral arguments, who was a Trump appointee, was very clear in saying, you know, I'm generally apt to believe that your argument is the stronger one in comparison to the defendant, which happens to be the entity denying coverage for transition-related care. So we're actually seeing wins, despite, I think, the politically conservative environment and the hostile climate that we're working in. Legally, we're actually making progress. Where we are not making progress, or where we're seeing challenges, are again on medical care bans for trans children. There are 22 states that have banned some kind of medical care for trans children, and nearly half of those laws have been challenged in federal court. There have been bans, a few bans that have gone into effect in states like Tennessee, Kentucky, Alabama, and Indiana, after appellate courts reversed lower court decisions. And here's really the rub too. There's also sports ban challenges as well. So there are 24 states that have passed bills banning trans students from participating in sports. There are right now some temporary injunctions blocking enforcement of said bans in states like Arizona, Idaho, West Virginia, and Utah, but these cases are still active, pending further judicial review. There's also some, as it's commonly known, bathroom ban challenges. And the reason I lift up all of these matters is that trans litigation is right now flooding our courts, particular federal courts. And there is the prospect that one of these matters, where there is a split in the circuit, will likely be considered by the Supreme Court. That is what we are right now keeping our eyes on. And this is particularly something that we're keeping our eyes on the healthcare ban front. There was a cert decision that was filed with the Supreme Court to review the Sixth Circuit Court's decision regarding healthcare bans. And so we could see in the next couple of years potentially a trans matter go before the Supreme Court. Now, Kenji, to your question, I think it's really important to name the Supreme Court declined that matter that you referenced, and I think it's actually because the Supreme Court has made their opinion clear vis-a-vis through Bostock. I think, looking at who the chief author was on that opinion, it was Chief Justice Gorsuch, and a leading conservative voice, someone that follows textualism to a T. And this is someone that made it very clear and had the majority opinion that found that you can't discriminate against a person based off of their sexual orientation or gender identity under Title VII. It's not the law of the land. And so I believe, and I think our colleagues believe at TILDEF, that the reason there has been a tepid response from the Supreme Court is that I think that we believe that it's been settled vis-a-vis through Bostock, and will be settled. The other matters will be settled in the lower courts.
Yeah, I'm going to turn to the audience questions now, and I love our community here, as everyone knows, and I'm heartened by so many of these questions. Many of them are talking about the kind of dire landscape, but the general tenor is what can we do if we roll up our sleeves? So let me bundle some questions together and get some homework or marching orders from you, Andy. So struggles continue and social progress is met with legislative setbacks for the LGBTQ plus community. What is your outlook on the kind of work we will all need to do in the next 5 to 10 years? So that's the first question in the bundle, but I have two more in the same vein of what can we do, not as legislators or as judges, but as just ordinary citizens who care deeply about these issues. I have a 6-year-old trans child. Do you have specific things that we as parents and the affirming adults in our lives can do to make the future safer for my child and other trans people and kids? And then the last one, I want to show my support for the transgender community, and I'm still on the journey of learning more about their struggles and needs. As an ally, what can I do on a personal and professional level? So I think this is just a character note, again, of the community of individuals that we're interacting with here, but we would love your suggestions and your homework for us, right? As to when we roll up our sleeves, what do we do, right, to support this, to support the community?
See, Kenji has talked to other executive directors because we usually come with calls to action and like things to do. So I have a few things for folks to do, and they're easy. They're easy. This is not hard. I want to make sure that folks understand like what trans people and I think trans activists right now are asking for are very basic, simple things that anyone can do. So let's start with what can we do now? There's a few things that I think that folks should really think about and lean into. And one, because there's so much vitriol and uncertainty around trans issues and trans people in this country, I think to the person's question, you got to learn. I think this is an opportunity for, I think, a lot of people in this country to be introduced to a whole new community that has often been invisible, that has gone underrepresented. And there may not be a lot of everyday information available. So I would say it's time to go to the library. It's time to like go consult organizations, Google. It's time to, I think, get familiar with the trans community and the lived experiences of trans people. And I think folks will find that the issues that really trans people are grappling with are very basic issues that I think everyday people who are not trans take for granted. It's things like safety, being able to walk down the street without worrying about being harassed or assaulted. It's about being able to, for trans people to realize their potential and access economic opportunity, applying for a job, not being discriminated on the job, being eligible for a promotion, those kinds of things, without being stereotyped or harassed or treated less than or unlike other colleagues in the workplace. And then there's things like respect. And I think for not just the trans movement right now, but I think for a lot of social justice movements, a lot of the conversations that are occurring right now about the everyday issues impacting many people, many communities, is at an escalated, heightened level. So, with that all being said, a couple of things that folks can do. One is support your local trans organization. There are many out there to choose from, and there are right now many that are under-resourced and need support to push back against the hostile rhetoric and also these hostile political efforts being directed at our community. And I also want to be clear too, they are being directed at our movement organizations as well. We have found that a lot of extremist activists have gone to target and surveil our organizations. And there is a need for increased capacity for making sure that our organizations are safe and secure for our staff and our volunteers and the like, and our clients. Two, look up your statewide equality organization wherever you live and become a member and become active. There's practically a statewide in every state in this country, and for New York, there are 2, 3 actually that folks can access and support and gain resources from. But really, the reason why I'm lifting up statewide organizations is because we need y'all to go lobby. We need you to share your stories. We need you to share your experiences and explicitly build really robust relationships with your lawmakers. We need community members to reach out to their electeds and let them know that they care about these issues. For some, like parents of trans children, that they have a direct impact on their families, and that people in this country do not support these kinds of hateful bills. The other thing, and I would be remiss because I am at NYU Law for not lifting this up. If you are working at a firm, in particular, volunteer your time with a trans organization or an LGBTQ plus organization that is working on trans law right now. There is a need for pro bono counsel. There is a need to tap into the wealth of resources and expertise that many of our white shoe law firms have. And I will lift up a couple. Wilkie in particular has been working hard on our Georgia matter as a pro bono partner with us. And there are dozens of others I can point to as well with our other legal work that we engage in. But if you're a lawyer or a legal professional, consider volunteering your time for the trans community. Kenji, I'm so sorry, but I think I missed a question in all of my responses.
No, that was beautiful. The question that we may not have gotten to was, I have a 6-year-old trans child. Do you have specific advice for what parents and affirming adults in our lives can do to make the future safer for children?
Yeah, there's, I think, 2. I'm just going to be quick and name 2 because I know we're almost at time. One is join a support group. Please join a family support group. I think that, there's been so much attention put on trans young people and trans people, but I think we forget oftentimes that it's not just trans people who need support, but the folks around us as well, who are supporting us. They also need access to resources and care. And I think parents in particular who are not only grappling with, oh, wow, my child has come out. I have no experience. This is completely new for me. In addition to figuring out all of those kinds of questions, there's also this heightened political landscape that can, I think, be deeply isolating and also create some, I think, loneliness for individuals for finding support and connection with like-minded people experiencing the same issues. So I would encourage you to join a family support group if you haven't done so already. And 2, I would say get involved with the trans organization as well. I will, on a personal note, I will say that over the 5-6 years that I've been in this role, the uptick in parents reaching out, either seeking resources for support or wanting to support our organization, like others, has gone well up. And so there's an opportunity to not only support organizations that are fighting for the rights of your kids and the future of your kiddos, but also an opportunity to find community of other like-minded parents as well who are in this fight.
Thank you so much. This may have to be our last question, but I will again bundle some questions because I see a theme emerging here. So how do you advise combating influencers in the anti-trans space? It seems that it's nearly impossible to combat misinformation and villainization. Chaya Raichik, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, operator of the Libs of TikTok social media accounts is the name that comes to mind. And then another questioner asked, can you speak to the recent article about detransitioners by Pamela Paul in the New York Times? And how, in my opinion, dangerous and misleading articles like these are fueled by pseudoscience and transphobia. But I think the general tenor of these questions, which I think is a really good instinct to be, do you have any advice, given that you've given us so much great information and advice over this hour? Do you have anything to say to us about misinformation and how to combat it in this domain?
This is a very, this is a big issue, not just for trans people, but I think just writ large for our country, and not just because of influencers, but also because of the introduction of AI and how that will have an impact as well. For folks like Chaya Raichik at Libs of TikTok, I think that, we are, and I'm not sure if this is why the question was asked, but Chaya has some connection to Oklahoma as well. Chaya serves on an advisory board of some kind tied to libraries, and I already mentioned that there are a number of book bans being considered by their legislature as well as their administrative agencies. But I think it's important to do your homework and for us to name the facts. And that's back to basics, really, and picking apart and investigating these individuals. Now, what makes this hard is that some of the news outlets or media outlets that we have traditionally relied on have also undergone some changes as well. And I think, in naming the detransitioners piece that came, I think, out of the New York Times, as well as a couple of others that have appeared in what I would describe as being more progressive news outlets. It is disturbing, and this also speaks to the nefarious efforts by our opposition as well too. They have been cultivating a diverse array of allies and influencers to tap and to be their mouthpieces at various angles. So here's what I can say and share with you, at least on the media coverage piece. TILDEF is a member of a coalition being led by AA GLAAD in response to a lot of the problematic coverage that we are witnessing come out of the New York Times. We're demanding that they, reassess their journalism standards and perhaps take a look at their history, their historical record on their coverage of trans issues, which has been good and has improved over the years, and yet we've seen a major dip in representation and facts. So there are efforts underway, but I think for everyday folks that are looking to push back, letters to the editor are a really important, and I think often overlooked tool that we can point to, as well as writing op-eds in your local newspapers and sharing your perspectives and stories about what it means to love a trans young person or to support a trans young person in this moment.
Amazing. So I think that brings us to a close. I do want to say, because I'm protective of our law firm sponsors, I think all of them have really rich, I know all of them have rich and robust pro bono practices. So I also want to encourage people to sort of tap into those resources as well. And then finally, Andy, this is such a dark time. We started in such a kind of gloomy place, but I think that you've shown us that the best antidote to that feeling of hopelessness is just sheer grit and work. So, thank you for all you're doing in the space. Thank you for educating us. Thank you for advising us and how we can all be better community members or allies, right, in the fight for trans equality. We all owe you a great debt. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, everybody. We're adjourned.